The envelope was taped to the underside of the drawer. Not hidden in plain sight, not tucked between old papers, deliberately, carefully taped, the way my husband did everything that mattered to him. Methodical, intentional, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking. I wasn't looking. I was cleaning out the home office on a Saturday morning in March, 2 years and 3 months after the funeral, finally ready to donate his books to the library the way his mother had been gently suggesting since Christmas. I pulled the drawer all the way out to reach the one stacked behind it, and the envelope came with it, stuck to the bottom with the kind of thick electrical tape my husband kept in the garage. My name was written on it in his handwriting, not Claire, the way he signed birthday cards, not C, the shorthand he used on grocery lists he left on the counter, Claire Ann Mercer, my full name, in the careful block letters he used when something was official, when something was serious. My husband had been dead for over 2 years. He'd driven off Route 9 on a rainy Tuesday evening coming home from a client meeting, and the county sheriff had called my cell phone while I was folding laundry. Single vehicle accident. Wet road. No other cars involved. The insurance company had paid out without dispute, and the case had been closed before the ground thawed the following spring. I sat down on the floor of his office holding an envelope he had hidden from me while he was alive. Inside was a small key, the kind that opens a safe deposit box, with a paper tag attached, Box 447, Clearwater Federal Savings. And beneath the key, a single index card. Don't open this with anyone in the room. Go alone. Tell no one, not even Emma. What you find will explain everything I couldn't tell you while I was alive. I'm sorry for the fear this will cause you. I'm more sorry for what made it necessary. You are the smartest person I have ever loved. Use that. I trust you completely. Daniel. I read it 6 times. I sat on the hardwood floor of my husband's office and read it until the words stopped, looking like words, and started looking like something else entirely, like a door I hadn't known existed, standing open in a wall I thought was solid. Don't tell Emma. My sister had moved back to our hometown 8 months after Daniel died, back into the spare bedroom of my house while she got back on her feet. She'd been the one who brought me food in those first hollow weeks, who slept on the couch so I wouldn't be alone in the house, who held me together when I was certain there was nothing left to hold. Emma was the only family I had left besides Daniel's mother. She was the last person in the world I would have thought to hide something from. Daniel had asked me to hide it from her anyway. I put the key in my coat pocket and drove to Clearwater Federal Savings at 9:15 on a Saturday morning. I told Emma I needed to pick up dry cleaning. The bank was quiet that early. A woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain smiled at me from behind the counter and walked me back to the vault without any small talk. I couldn't have survived that morning. Box 447 was toward the bottom of the wall. It took both her key and mine to open it. She left me alone in the small private room with a metal box the size of a shoebox, and I sat down at the table and lifted the lid. Inside was a USB drive, a manila folder thick with papers, and a sealed letter with my name on it. I opened the letter first. Claire, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me that was not an accident. I need you to understand that before anything else. Whatever you've been told, whatever the official story is, I need you to know that I would never leave you by choice, not for any reason, not ever. The room was very small. The air tasted like metal and controlled temperature. I kept reading. 18 months ago, I discovered that my business partner, Marcus Reed, had been running a separate set of books through our company since before I joined the firm, not skimming a full parallel accounting system, using legitimate client funds to back fraudulent investment products sold to people who didn't know what they were buying. When I found the first discrepancy, I thought it was an error. When I found the second, I started keeping records. By the time I understood what he was actually doing, I had documented over $4 million in fraudulent transactions, and Marcus had realized I was looking. I set the letter down. My hands were shaking. I pressed them flat on the table, breathed, picked the letter back up. He came to me 6 months ago and offered me a choice. Walk away, take a silent partnership in what the company would become, or find out what happens to people who threaten his business. I chose a third option. I started making copies. Everything is on the drive. Every transaction, every client account that was used, every wire transfer. There's also a folder of audio recordings I made during conversations with Marcus after I confronted him, and a document where I've written everything I know in the order I know it. I arranged this box because I needed somewhere to put the truth that Marcus couldn't reach. I'm sorry I didn't tell you while I was alive. I was afraid that if you knew, you'd be in danger too. I was trying to protect you the only way I knew how. The file on the drive labeled Start Here will explain what I need you to do. I plugged the USB drive into my phone using the adapter I always kept in my purse. The folder called Start Here contained a single document, and I read it sitting in that vault room with my coat still on and my hands still trembling. Daniel had written it like a letter, or maybe like a legal brief, thorough, ordered, calm, in that particular way of his that used to make me feel safe during every hard thing we'd ever faced together. He explained the full scope of what Marcus had built. He named names. He identified a woman named Sandra Howell, who worked in the compliance department at the investment firm that processed Marcus's fraudulent products, as the inside contact who had been approving transactions she knew were fraudulent. He had email chains, phone records, and bank statements, all organized by date, all cross-referenced. At the end of the document, he had written, "I don't know how much time I have. If you're reading this, I may have run out of it. If I'm still alive when you find this, I'll explain everything face to face, and this was just a precaution. But if I'm not, I need you to take this drive to a federal agent, not local law enforcement. I have reason to believe Marcus has a connection inside the county sheriff's office. His brother-in-law is a deputy. I don't know how deep it goes. Don't trust anyone local. Go federal." I drove home from the bank with my husband's USB drive in my coat pocket and 2 years of grief rearranging itself into something harder and colder in my chest. Not an accident. He had written it in the first line. Whatever you've been told, it was not an accident. My husband had gone off Route 9 on a rainy Tuesday evening, and every single person I trusted had told me it was a wet road and a terrible, random piece of bad luck, and I had believed them because I had no reason not to, and because the alternative was something my brain had refused to hold. I parked in my own driveway and sat there for 10 minutes before I went inside. Emma was in the kitchen making coffee, wearing one of my sweatshirts, her hair still up from sleeping. She looked exactly like she always looked on a Saturday morning, warm and familiar and utterly herself, and I thought about Daniel's index card. Tell no one. Not even Emma. "You look pale," she said. "Did something happen?" "Dry cleaning was closed," I said. "I forgot they're closed Saturdays now." She made a face of mild sympathy and handed me a mug, and I stood in my own kitchen and smiled at my sister and felt the USB drive in my pocket like it had its own heartbeat. I needed to read everything before I did anything. That was what I kept telling myself as I carried my coffee to the office and closed the door. Read everything first. Then decide. It took me 4 hours. I read every document, listened to every audio file, worked through every spreadsheet until I understood the architecture of what Marcus had built. It was elegant, in the way that terrible things sometimes are, a system of smaller frauds, nested inside legitimate business activity, difficult to detect precisely because it was so thoroughly integrated with real transactions. Daniel had found it only because he'd been suspicious about a single client account that didn't behave the way he expected, and had pulled a thread until the whole sweater started to unravel. The audio files were the worst part. Daniel's voice, clear and controlled, asking Marcus direct questions during what were clearly business meetings questions designed to elicit admissions that Marcus gave without realizing he was being recorded. At the end of the third file, Marcus's voice dropped into something flat and cold, and he said, "Daniel, I like you. I genuinely do. But I need you to understand that I have been doing this for 11 years, and in that time, 3 people have tried to do what you're doing right now. None of them succeeded. Think carefully about what you want your life to look like in 6 months." Daniel's voice, very steady. "Is that a threat, Marcus?" A pause. Then, "It's a description of historical patterns." I closed the audio file. I opened the next one. There were 7 recordings total. In the last one, made a week before Daniel died, his voice was different, quieter, faster, like a man trying to get through a list before he ran out of time. He said, Marcus called again. "I think he's made a decision. I'm moving the backup copies to the bank box tomorrow morning, and I'm going to call the FBI field office on Monday. I should have done this months ago, I kept thinking I could manage it, keep everyone safe, find a way through that didn't blow everything up. That was naive. Claire, if you're hearing this, I love you. I love you more than any amount of careful planning or self-protection. And I'm sorry I handled this the way I handled it. You deserve to know. You always deserve to know. The recording ended. I sat very still in my husband's office for a long time. Then I took out my phone and searched for the FBI field office nearest to our county. It took me 2 days to make the call. Not because I was uncertain, but because I needed those 2 days to make copies of everything, upload the files to 3 separate encrypted cloud accounts, and write out a clear summary of what Daniel had documented, organized chronologically, the way he had taught me to organize difficult information when we used to stay up late on weeknights, helping each other with things that needed to be thought through carefully. He was a financial analyst. I was a paralegal. We had spent 10 years of marriage being useful to each other in practical, specific ways, and preparing those files was the most intact I had felt since the night the sheriff called. On Monday morning, I dropped Emma off at her therapy appointment she'd been going every week since Daniel died, and I had always been the one who drove her, which meant I had 45 minutes, and I sat in my car in the parking lot of a coffee shop across town and made the call. The agent who took my call had a professional, unhurried voice that reminded me of a very good doctor. The kind who doesn't react to bad news in ways that make you more frightened. Her name was Agent Patricia Holloway, and she asked me clear, specific questions for 22 minutes, and at the end she said, "Mrs. Mercer, I need you to come in this week, in person, with everything you have. Can you do that?" "Yes," I said. "I can do that. Don't discuss this with anyone in your immediate circle until we've had a chance to review the materials. I know that's difficult. It's important." "I know," I said. Emma called 3 times while I was on the phone with the FBI. I called her back and said I'd lost track of time, and she laughed and said the therapist had run long anyway. And I drove across town to pick her up and listen to her talk about her session the whole way home, and she didn't notice that I hadn't said more than 12 words. The meeting with Agent Holloway was on Wednesday. I told Emma I was having lunch with a colleague and drove 40 minutes to the field office with a flash drive in my purse and Daniel's letter in a sealed envelope because I felt, in some way I couldn't entirely articulate, that she should read it, that someone official should see it in his handwriting. Agent Holloway was in her 40s, precise, and had the particular quality of attention that made you feel that nothing you said would be wasted. She read Daniel's letter carefully. She went through my summary document page by page. When she looked up, she said, "Mrs. Mercer, your husband built an exceptionally thorough case. The audio recordings alone are significant. Combined with the financial documentation, this is serious." "I know," I said. "We've had Marcus Reed on a watch list for 14 months. We couldn't move without a primary source inside the transactions. What your husband collected is exactly what we were missing." "How long had you been watching him?" I asked, "before Daniel died?" Her expression didn't change, but something shifted behind it. "We opened the file 8 months before your husband's accident. We weren't aware of his independent investigation until now." I felt the words land in the exact way they were shaped to land. "I want to be very direct with you," she said. "We are going to look very carefully at the circumstances of your husband's death. I'm not making any representations about what we'll find, but we are going to look." I nodded. I had spent 2 days preparing myself for this moment, and I still had to press my hands flat on the table to keep them steady. She asked me about my daily life, who I saw regularly, who knew about the bank box, who had been in contact with me since Daniel died. I told her about Emma. I told her that Daniel had specifically asked me not to tell Emma, and that I didn't know why, and that I had honored the request even though it made me feel like I was lying to the person I was closest to in the world. Agent Holloway wrote something down. "Does your sister know Marcus Reed?" I started to say no, and then I stopped. Emma had started dating someone new, 4 months ago. She'd been shy about it at first, the way she always was when she was uncertain, vague about his name, vague about how they'd met, showing me pictures on her phone but always at an angle that made it hard to see a face clearly. Last month, she'd told me his name was Marco, that he worked in finance, that she'd met him through a friend of a friend at a dinner party. "Marco," she'd said. "Marco." The room seemed to contract slightly around me. "Mrs. Mercer?" "Marco Reed." I said slowly. My sister has been dating a man named Marco. She told me his last name last week. She said it like it was new information she was ready to share. Holloway put down her pen. Did she tell you his last name? Reed, I said. A very specific quality of stillness settled over the room. I need you to listen to me very carefully, she said. I need you to go home, behave exactly as you have been behaving, and do not indicate to your sister in any way that this conversation has occurred. Can you do that? I said yes, but what I was thinking about was Emma's face last Tuesday when she'd talked about Marco over dinner, the way her voice had gotten softer in the middle of his name, the way she'd said he actually listens like it was something remarkable. My sister had been hurt badly enough in the past that a man who listened felt like a discovery. She didn't know. I was almost certain she didn't know. But the possibility that she might know sat in my chest like a splinter, small, precise, impossible to ignore. I drove home and made dinner and smiled at my sister across the kitchen table. And when she mentioned Marco and said he'd asked to take her to dinner that Friday, I said that sounded lovely, and I meant none of it. The next 9 days were the most technically demanding and emotionally exhausting of my life, and I had buried my husband. Agent Holloway called me every other day on a number she'd given me that went directly to her. She told me what she could, which wasn't much, and she told me when to do nothing, which was almost always. I went to work. I made dinner. I asked Emma about her week and listened to the answers and smiled in the right places. And every time she mentioned Marco, I stored the detail she gave me and relayed it to Agent Holloway on our next call. He'd said he was traveling for work. He'd canceled Friday dinner at the last minute, apologized with flowers delivered to the house. He'd asked Emma twice, casually, whether I had ever found anything when I cleaned out Daniel's home office. I told Holloway about that last one, and there was a pause on the line, and then she said, Mrs. Mercer, we're accelerating our timeline. There are some things I need to tell you. She told me on a Thursday evening while Emma was at yoga. She told me that her team's forensic accountants had spent 9 days going through everything Daniel had documented, and that the case was solid. She told me that the investigation into Daniel's accident had found something that the original report had not. A witness who had been driving behind him on Route 9 that evening, who had told no one at the time because she hadn't understood what she'd seen. A dark SUV following very close to Daniel's car in the rain, and then accelerating into the back of it just before the curve. The witness had moved to a different county 6 months later. Nobody had followed up. I sat in my kitchen and held the phone and did not say anything for a long time. The registered owner of the SUV, Holloway said, has a prior connection to Marcus Reed going back 11 years. I said, What happens now? We move tomorrow. I need you to be somewhere other than your house between noon and 4 in the afternoon. Take your sister with you if you can. Somewhere public, somewhere with people around you. And Mrs. Mercer, after tomorrow, this will be over. I called Emma that night and asked if she wanted to drive up to the orchard the next county over that she'd mentioned wanting to visit since October. She said yes before I'd finished the sentence. We left at 11:30. Emma drove because she said I looked tired, and I let her, because I was, in ways I couldn't explain. The orchard was an hour away. All bare branches and mud and the kind of quiet that early spring has before it commits to being warm. Emma bought apple butter and a bottle of hard cider, and we walked the rows of trees and talked about things that had nothing to do with any of it. My phone buzzed at 2:17. A text from Agent Holloway. Done. All parties in custody. Call me when you're ready. I stopped walking. Emma took 3 more steps before she noticed and turned back to look at me. Claire? What is it? I had rehearsed nothing. I had planned nothing for this moment because I hadn't known what the moment would be, and standing in a muddy orchard in March wasn't what I'd pictured. I need to tell you something, I said. I need you to listen to the whole thing before you say anything, okay? All of it, from the beginning. She listened. She stood very still among the bare apple trees and listened to everything: the envelope under the drawer, the bank box, Daniel's letter, the recordings, the FBI, and finally, Marco. I watched her face go through things I didn't have words for. She was 34 years old, and she had lost her brother-in-law the same week I'd lost my husband, and I had watched grief shape her over 2 years into someone quieter and more careful than she'd been before. She had believed she'd found something good. I watched her understand that it had been constructed. He asked about the office. she said finally. Her voice was completely flat. He asked me twice if you'd found anything. I thought he was just making conversation. I know. I told him no, because you hadn't told me anything. She looked at me, and her expression was not what I expected. It was not anger. It was something much older. He used me to get to you. Emma, don't apologize, she said. Daniel told you not to tell me. He was right. If I'd known anything. She stopped. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment. If I'd known, I wouldn't have been able to hide it. He would have seen it. She was right. We both knew she was right. We stood in the orchard for a while without talking. A bird moved somewhere in the branches above us, and the mud smelled like thaw, like the particular alive smell of winter ending. Daniel knew, Emma said quietly. He knew Marco was coming, or someone like him. That's why he told you not to tell me. He was protecting us both the only way he could figure out how to. She nodded, very slowly, and then she looked at me with something in her eyes that I recognized as the same thing I'd felt in that vault room on a Saturday morning, reading my husband's letter grief, reshaping itself into something harder and colder, and then, beneath that, something else, something that could stand up. Tell me everything, she said. Everything, you know. Not the summary everything. I told her everything, walking back to the car and then sitting in the parking lot of the orchard with the apple butter in the back seat, going through all of it piece by piece, the way Daniel would have done it. Thorough. Ordered. Nothing left out. The arraignment happened 6 weeks later. Marcus Reed and Sandra Howell on federal fraud charges. The driver of the SUV on vehicular homicide. 2 other individuals from the county sheriff's office on charges that were listed in the indictment in language that was precise and merciless. Daniel's death was reclassified. There was a new death certificate. It should have felt like something small, a piece of paper, a change in a database, and instead it felt like being allowed to grieve correctly for the first time. Agent Holloway testified at the preliminary hearing. So did I. I wore the gray blazer Daniel had once told me I looked serious in. And I sat in the witness box and answered every question in exactly the order it was asked. Clearly and without embellishment, the way a paralegal who has spent a decade knowing what evidence needs to sound like knows how to do. Marcus Reed watched me from the defense table. He had a particular quality of expression, the kind that expects to be the most capable person in any given room, and it was very satisfying to watch it fail to do what he wanted it to do. After I was dismissed, I walked back to the gallery and Emma reached over and squeezed my hand without looking at me, and I held onto her hand for the rest of the morning. We sold the investment firm what was left of it, the legitimate portion that Daniel had built before Marcus had integrated it into his system through a court-ordered process that recovered enough to compensate every defrauded client in full, with modest damages. I watched the investor restitution list go out and thought about Daniel's recordings, his voice saying the clients didn't know what they were buying, with the particular quality of anger he had when something unfair had been done to someone who trusted someone they shouldn't have had to be suspicious of. He had spent the last 18 months of his life trying to fix it. He had died trying to fix it. And it had been fixed, in the end, because he'd known me well enough to know I could finish it, that I was the right person to leave the truth with. I had known Daniel for 14 years. I had thought, toward the end of those 2 years of grief, that I was starting to forget the specific texture of his presence, the particular way he moved through a room, the sound of his voice from the next room over when he was talking on the phone. I had thought memory was failing me the way everyone says it does. It wasn't failing me. It was just stored differently than I'd thought. He was in the way I organized those files for Holloway. He was in the way I read evidence, the way I walked into a room and made myself useful instead of waiting to be helped. He was in 14 years of paying attention to someone worth paying attention to, and you don't lose that. It becomes part of the structure of how you think. That fall, his mother came for Thanksgiving. She was 71 and had driven 8 hours from where she'd moved after Daniel died, and she sat at my kitchen table while Emma and I cooked, and she said almost nothing for a long time. Then, while Emma was in the other room, she said, "He told me he'd hidden something for you, a few weeks before he died. He said, 'Mom, if anything ever happens to me, tell Claire to look where I keep things that are important.'" I didn't know what he meant. I didn't know what to do with it. I've thought about it every day since. I sat down across from her. "I should have found it sooner," she said. Her eyes were very direct, like Daniel's had been. I should have said something sooner, but I didn't understand what he was telling me, and I was afraid of making things worse for you if I was wrong. You weren't wrong, I told her. You were just missing the piece he'd given me. Did it matter? In the end? The timing? I thought about it honestly. 2 years versus 2 months. The grief was the same. The task would have been harder when it was rawer or perhaps easier, because rage is a kind of fuel. I didn't know. What I knew was that I had found it when I found it, and I had done what needed to be done. And Marcus Reed was facing 23 years in federal prison, and the clients who had trusted him had their money back, and my husband had been right about me. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was the exact specific thing he had known it would be, and knowing he had known that, knowing he had planned for the version of me that would find that envelope and understand what it meant, and go to the bank alone, and read everything, and call the FBI, knowing that was the grief, made into something else. Not healed, not gone, just transformed into the particular shape of being known by someone completely, even now. I sometimes go back to the vault room in my mind, the way you revisit a room where something important happened. I think about sitting down at that table with the metal box and the sealed letter and my coat still on, not knowing yet, and I think about the version of me that existed before I pulled that drawer all the way out. She thought her husband's death was a wet road and a terrible accident. She thought grief was the whole story. She thought the most frightening thing that had already happened to her was the most frightening thing she would have to face. She was wrong about all of it, and I am grateful every day for how wrong she was. Now let me ask you something. If you found an envelope with your name on it hidden somewhere in your house, in handwriting you recognized, dated before someone you loved disappeared, would you open it, or would you be afraid of what was inside? Tell me in the comments. I'd really like to know.